In the year 1823, in a small Appalachian mountain town, something happened that people would whisper about for generations. Something carried on cold winds and remembered beside quiet hearth fires. They spoke of a hunter who walked beyond the last marked trees, beyond the place where the elders stopped and lowered their voices, beyond a warning older than the town itself. Some said it was pride that led him there. Others claimed it was hunger or stubbornness, but all agreed that the forest had given its caution plainly enough. What happened after he ignored that warning was not loud or sudden, but slow and patient, like frost creeping across a window in the night. The town of Briar's Hollow rested between steep ridges and a winding river. Its wooden houses crouched low against winter winds, smoke rising in pale ribbons beneath a sky the color of cold steel. It was late autumn, when the leaves had turned the hillsides to amber and rust, and the mornings arrived wrapped in silver mist that clung to boots and hems. The forest beyond the settlement stretched dark and dense, hemlock and pine crowding close together, their branches whispering whenever the wind threaded through their needles. At dawn, the river groaned softly against its banks. Geese cut sharp lines across the sky, and the distant knock of an axe echoed like a steady heartbeat. Game had grown scarce that season, the deer moving deeper into the high ridges, the traps returning empty more often than not, leaving many pantry shelves thin and wanting. Among the townsfolk lived a hunter named Caleb Mercer, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and eyes the pale gray of river stones. He wore a buckskin coat darkened by years of rain and sweat, a coonskin cap pulled low over his brow, and carried a long rifle he had named Providence. Caleb was known for his steady aim and quiet tread, for bringing meat when others returned with excuses, and for trusting his own judgment above any man's counsel. Yet he carried a restlessness that no full larder could quiet, a hunger not only for game, but for proof that no forest shadow could master him. At the northern edge of Briar's Hollow stood a crooked cedar post, carved with old markings and bound with faded red cloth, placed there by the town's founders. The elders claimed that beyond that marker lay a stretch of forest best left undisturbed, a valley where the wind did not behave as wind should. Caleb had heard the stories since boyhood, told in low tones beside crackling fires, warnings of strange echoes and trails that shifted like living things. He would listen without interruption, then lean back in his chair and say, "A forest is trees and soil, nothing more, and I've walked through worse." Some nodded at his confidence. Others exchanged uneasy glances, for they remembered winters when men had vanished beyond that cedar post. As the frost thickened and hunger sharpened its quiet edge, Caleb's eyes began drifting northward more often, toward the dark line of trees no one else would cross. One evening, as wind pressed against the cabin shutters, Caleb stood by the hearth and studied the thin venison hanging from a hook, measuring how many meals it might stretch before the snow sealed the passes. His younger sister, Mary, folded blankets near the fire and watched him in silence, sensing the direction of his thoughts long before he spoke them aloud. "They say the northern valley is thick with elk this year," Caleb muttered, running an oiled cloth along his rifle barrel, his voice steady but edged with impatience. Mary's hands stilled, and she glanced toward the dark window where frost traced pale veins across the glass. "You know what Father used to say about that place," she answered softly, her words careful as stepping stones across ice. Caleb gave a faint smile that did not reach his eyes and replied, "Father feared stories more than storms." The next morning he visited the trading post, where men gathered around a barrel stove, boots steaming and hats tipped low against drifting ash. Old Thomas Reed, whose beard had long since turned the color of snowfall, fixed Caleb with a knowing look. "You're thinking of crossing that cedar post," Thomas said, not as a question, but as a tired recognition. Caleb shrugged, the movement casual though his jaw tightened. "We need meat," he answered, glancing at the empty hooks along the wall. Thomas leaned closer, lowering his voice until it nearly blended with the hiss of burning wood. Game wanders there for a reason, and sometimes it ain't because the grass is sweeter. A few men shifted uneasily, staring into the stove as if it might offer safer ground than the subject at hand. Caleb felt their doubt like a weight against his shoulders, and pride stirred within him, sharp and hot. "Fear won't fill a stew pot," he said, fastening his coat with deliberate calm. That afternoon, he walked to the northern edge of town, boots crunching through frost-stiffened grass, breath rising in pale clouds before him. The cedar post stood crooked as ever, its red cloth faded to a dull brown, fluttering weakly in the wind like a warning grown tired. For a long moment, Caleb studied the carved markings, tracing them with his eyes as though deciphering a map. The forest beyond seemed ordinary at first glance, trees layered upon trees, shadows pooled between trunks where sunlight failed to reach. Yet there was a stillness that pressed inward, a silence too complete for midday, as though even birds hesitated to cross that invisible boundary. Caleb adjusted the strap of his powder horn and stepped forward, boots passing the cedar post without ceremony. Behind him, the wind caught the red cloth and snapped it sharply, the sound echoing like a small, disapproving crack of thunder. He did not turn back. Deeper he walked, the air cooling with each measured stride, the scent of pine thickening until it tasted almost bitter on his tongue. Soon he noticed the absence of tracks in the soft earth, no deer prints, no rabbit trails, nothing to suggest life moving freely through the undergrowth. Still, he pressed on, telling himself the animals simply kept higher ground. A branch snapped somewhere to his left, sudden and distinct, causing him to pause with rifle half raised. "Just wind," he murmured under his breath, though the trees stood motionless. The path behind him seemed narrower than before, shadows stretching long and thin like fingers reaching toward his boots. He felt, for the first time, a faint tremor of uncertainty, but pride whispered louder than caution, urging him deeper into the waiting trees. As afternoon thinned toward evening, Caleb found the land sloping downward into a shallow valley where mist lingered close to the ground, curling around tree trunks like pale, patient hands. The silence there felt heavier, as though sound itself had been muffled beneath layers of damp earth and fallen needles. He crouched beside a narrow stream, its surface dark and glassy, noticing fresh hoofprints pressed deep into the mud along the bank. A hunter's satisfaction flickered across his face, for the prints were large and recent, pointing further into the hollow. "See," he muttered to no one, rising with renewed purpose. Nothing here but flesh and bone. He followed the tracks through a corridor of leaning pines, their branches interlocked overhead, dimming the light until the valley resembled late dusk. Soon he spotted movement ahead, the unmistakable shape of a bull elk standing broadside between two trees, antlers branching like winter limbs. Caleb steadied his breath, lifted Providence to his shoulder, and let the world narrow to the quiet circle of his sight. The shot cracked through the valley, sharp and final, echoing once before being swallowed whole. When the smoke drifted aside, the elk lay still upon the forest floor, its breath already fading into the cold air. Relief and triumph warmed Caleb's chest, and he approached the fallen animal with confident strides. Yet as he knelt to inspect his prize, he felt a subtle shift in the air, a faint vibration beneath his palms against the earth. The mist thickened abruptly, rolling in with unnatural speed, obscuring the trees until they became vague silhouettes. Caleb rose slowly, scanning his surroundings, surprised to find that the stream he had followed was no longer visible. He dragged the elk a short distance, intending to field dress it quickly, but the ground seemed uneven, rising where it had been flat. A low sound carried through the fog, neither growl nor wind, but something between, like breath drawn through hollow bone. Caleb turned sharply toward the noise, rifle ready, though no shape presented itself within the whitening haze. "Show yourself," he called, his voice firm though his pulse had begun to quicken. The only reply was a distant echo of his own words, warped and delayed, as though the valley mocked him. He attempted to retrace his steps, dragging the elk toward where he believed the stream had been, yet every direction looked the same. Trees seemed to stand in new places, trunks leaning at unfamiliar angles, roots twisting like serpents across the soil. The red cloth of the cedar post was nowhere in sight, nor any sign of the open woods he had crossed earlier that day. As twilight deepened, the mist took on a bluish cast, and the temperature dropped sharply, biting through his buckskin coat. Caleb abandoned the elk at last, realizing its weight would only slow him, though leaving it felt like surrendering proof of his judgment. He marked a tree with his knife, carving a deep line into the bark, then walked in a straight line as best he could. After several tense minutes, he halted abruptly, staring at a familiar trunk bearing a fresh cut in its side. His own mark looked back at him. A thin strand of doubt tightened into something colder, something closer to fear, though he would not yet name it aloud. Night settled fully, and with it came faint lights glimmering between the trees, small flickers like distant lanterns swaying in unseen hands. Caleb watched them cautiously, uncertain whether they promised rescue or ruin, knowing only that the warning he had ignored now felt less like superstition and more like memory awakening. The lights drifted slowly through the mist, rising and falling as though carried by invisible currents, never steady enough to mark as lanterns, never wild enough to dismiss as fireflies. Caleb chose one glow and followed, boots sliding over damp leaves, rifle clutched tight, as though iron and powder could anchor him to reason. The light seemed near at first, then slipped further ahead, always just beyond the reach of his outstretched hand. "Enough of this," he muttered, anger pushing back against the tightening ring of fear in his chest. He fired a shot into the air, the crack splitting the valley with desperate force. The echo returned not once, but many times, overlapping and circling him, as if unseen throats repeated the sound in quiet mockery. The lights vanished at once, swallowed by darkness so complete it felt solid against his face. In that sudden blackness, Caleb heard footsteps that did not match his own, slow and measured, pacing him from somewhere just beyond sight. He turned sharply, raising his rifle toward the sound, yet every direction offered only shadow and drifting fog. Then a voice came, low and familiar, shaped like memory more than speech. "Caleb," it whispered, carrying the tone of his late father beside a winter fire. His breath caught, and for a fleeting instant he saw through the mist the outline of a man standing between the trees. The figure did not move closer, did not threaten, but simply watched with a sorrow that cut deeper than any blade. "You were told," the voice murmured, not harsh, not angry, only certain. Caleb's hands trembled, and the rifle lowered inch by inch until its barrel pointed toward the damp earth. "I needed meat," he answered into the darkness, the words sounding small and unconvincing. The valley seemed to inhale around him, a deep and patient breath, as though weighing his confession. In that suspended moment, Caleb understood that the warning had never been about beasts or spirits, but about humility before what could not be mastered. The ground beneath him shifted subtly, and the mist began to thin, revealing a narrow path leading upward toward faint starlight. He hesitated only once, glancing back toward where the elk had fallen, then stepped onto the revealed trail without another word. The footsteps behind him faded, and the valley fell silent once more, holding its secrets close. Near dawn, Caleb stumbled past the cedar post, its red cloth brushing his sleeve like a quiet acknowledgement. He did not carry the elk, nor did he look back toward the northern trees. When townsfolk found him walking slowly through Briar's Hollow, They noticed the change before he spoke a single word. His shoulders, once squared with pride, now bore a gentler curve, as though something heavy had been set down within him. Old Thomas Reed studied his face and asked no questions, sensing that answers had already taken root where boasting once lived. Caleb returned to hunting the familiar ridges south of town, bringing home what game he could without complaint. He never again spoke lightly of the cedar post, nor dismissed the stories told by flickering firelight. Children who asked about the northern valley received only a quiet shake of his head and a steady, thoughtful gaze. And in that valley, people learned that some mistakes don't echo loudly, they whisper for generations.